Her family sold fat, obese daughter as useless burden. But the lonely mountain man built her a palace and called her my queen. "She's nothing but a useless burden," Victoria Hayes hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut through the winter air. "Fat, slow, and worth less than the food she eats." The words rang out across Cedar Falls' crowded square, where villagers gathered to see William Hayes do the unthinkable, auction off his own daughter, Magnolia Maggie. Hayes stood trembling, her face blotched red from shame. At 26, she had carried a lifetime of ridicule on her wide shoulders, her heavy frame always the town's favorite target. Today, her father and stepmother stripped her of the last thing she had left, dignity. "Who'll take her?" William slurred, half drunk, lifting his arms to the crowd. $100, and she's yours. Cheap for a woman who eats like two men." Laughter erupted. Someone shouted, "I wouldn't pay a dime for that cow." Another bellowed, "Sell her by the pound." Maggie bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. She had expected cruelty, but never this, a public sale, her worth measured in jeers and pocket change. Then silence fell. From the back of the crowd, a giant moved forward, nearly 7 feet tall, his frame thick with muscle, his beard black as coal, his eyes the stormy green of deep pine forests. Caleb Thornfield, the black bear of Pine Mountain. Rumor painted him as half wild, a recluse who built fortresses in the woods and broke men with his bare hands. Yet when he stopped before Maggie, he spoke not like a beast, but like a man. "I'll take her," he said, laying down $200 in gold, his voice low but steady. Gasps spread through the square. Maggie lifted her eyes, stunned. For the first time in her life, someone had claimed her, not as shame, but as choice. Magnolia Maggie Hayes had never known kindness within her own home. Her mother had died when she was only 8, and the girl who once baked biscuits at her mother's knee became the target of cruelty when William Hayes remarried. Victoria Hayes was as beautiful as she was cold, her sharp cheekbones and calculating smile hiding a heart of stone. To her, Maggie's broad frame and gentle spirit were weaknesses to exploit. "You'll never wed," Victoria would sneer as she shoved a broom into Maggie's hands. "No man wants a fat sow lumbering through his doorway. Best you learn your place, scrubbing floors and slopping hogs." And William, her father, the man meant to protect her, had long since drowned his will in whiskey. Each night he staggered home, pockets empty from gambling, and each morning Maggie paid the price, working from dawn until midnight. She cooked, mended, shoveled snow, hauled water, yet still they called her lazy, useless, unwanted. When Victoria bore a son, Maggie's fate was sealed. "We have a true heir now," she told William, her hand resting smugly on the child's cradle. "That girl is nothing but another mouth to feed." So it was no surprise when they dragged her into town one bitter morning, yet Maggie still hadn't expected the cruelty of hearing her father auction her off as if she were livestock. The laughter, the jeers, the look of smug triumph on Victoria's painted face, all carved deep wounds in her heart. And then Caleb Thornfield had stepped forward. The moment Maggie climbed into his wagon, she braced herself for harshness. Men as large and fearsome as Caleb did not buy women to treat them gently. She sat rigid, clutching her shawl as the horses pulled them away from the town. The wind stung her cheeks, but it was nothing compared to the sting of humiliation still burning inside. Caleb said little during the journey, yet when the road grew rough, he slowed the horses and glanced her way. "You cold?" he asked, his voice deep, steady. Maggie blinked, startled. No, sir." He tossed a thick wool blanket across her lap anyway. "You'll freeze without it." Later, when the wagon jolted over a stone and Maggie clutched her side, Caleb frowned. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then whispered, "A little." Without a word, he passed her a parcel of bread and smoked venison. She hadn't expected food, hadn't expected anything but commands. She ate quietly, her eyes stinging, not from the wind this time, but from the shock of such simple kindness. Hours later, when they crested the ridge, Maggie gasped. Below, nestled in a valley of pines, stood not the ramshackle cabin she had imagined, but a home, a grand lodge of carved logs with tall windows gleaming in the fading sun, a broad balcony overlooking the valley, and a chimney puffing smoke like a welcome. This is where you live?" she whispered. Caleb guided the horses down the path. "Built it with my own hands. Took 3 years." His eyes flicked to hers, steady but not unkind. "Been waiting for someone to share it with." Maggie's throat tightened. All her life she had been told she was worthless, unwanted, unlovable. And now here was a man, frightening, yes, but steady and true, who had paid gold to take her from humiliation and brought her not to a prison, but to a palace in the wilderness. She didn't yet know if she could trust him, but for the first time in her life, hope stirred. The wagon creaked and swayed as Caleb guided the horses higher into the mountains. The snow deepened, muffling the sound of hooves, while pines crowded close on either side like silent sentinels. Maggie clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to still the shiver in her bones. She wasn't sure if it came from the cold or from the uncertainty of the man beside her. For hours, Caleb rode in silence, his massive hand steady on the reins. The wind caught in his beard, and his broad shoulders seemed carved from the same stone as the mountain itself. Maggie had heard all the rumors, that he was half wild, that he'd killed men in tavern brawls, that he lived alone because no one dared share his roof. And now she was to share it. When the sun slipped low, Caleb finally spoke. "Cabin's another hour," he said, "but the horses need rest." He pulled the wagon to a sheltered clearing and made quick work of tending to the animals. Then he turned to Maggie. "Stay in the wagon. I'll make a fire." But Maggie couldn't sit idle. Years of being ordered and scolded had taught her to anticipate labor. "I can help," she offered timidly. Caleb studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether she meant it. Then he handed her an armful of dry pine branches. "Stack these by the fire ring." Her heart fluttered strangely. Was this trust? She did as told, and soon flames crackled, painting gold across the snow. Caleb handed her a tin cup of steaming broth from a pot he carried in his provisions. Maggie sipped, warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb only nodded, but the flicker in his green eyes was softer than his silence. That night, he spread blankets in the wagon for her. "You take the bedroll. I'll sleep by the fire." She blinked. "But you'll freeze." "I've slept colder," he said simply, his tone brooking no argument. Yet the gesture struck Maggie deeply. No man had ever thought of her comfort first, not even her own father. The next day they reached the lodge. Inside, Maggie's breath caught again. The home was vast, the rafters soaring overhead, walls lined with shelves of carved wood. A stone fireplace large enough to walk into glowed at the center. Rugs softened the floors, and the scent of cedar filled the air. It was not just shelter, it was beauty. crafted by a man who had poured his soul into it. "You'll have this room," Caleb said, showing her a chamber with a carved bedstead and quilted blankets. "It's yours." Maggie turned to him, startled. "You built all this?" His scarred hands brushed over the wooden doorframe, every beam, every nail. Then, more quietly, "I thought I'd build for someone who never came." Her chest ached. For the first time, she saw not a monster, but a lonely man, one who had carved his dreams into timber and stone, waiting for someone to call it home. In the days that followed, Maggie learned that Caleb's silence was not coldness, but care. He rose before dawn to chop wood, leaving kindling stacked neatly for her. He returned from hunting with venison and grouse, and always let her take the first serving. When she offered to cook, he surprised her by eating with genuine praise. "Best bread I've had in years," he told her after her first loaf. And though her face flushed, the warmth of his words lingered long after the meal. At night, by the fire, he began to share fragments of his past. How he'd once been an engineer, how the fire had taken his family, how solitude had seemed easier than loss. Maggie listened, her heart twisting with each revelation, and slowly something shifted. She began to laugh again, soft at first, then freer. Caleb's eyes lit whenever he heard it, though he never said why. And when their hands brushed one evening as she passed him a plate, neither pulled away. For Maggie, who had lived her life under scorn and shadow, it was the smallest touch, but it felt like the spark of a flame she never believed could be hers. The days in Pine Mountain followed a rhythm Maggie had never known, steady, honest, and strangely peaceful. Each dawn began with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of Caleb splitting logs outside. His axe rose and fell in a rhythm as sure as his heartbeat, and Maggie often found herself watching through the frosted window, wondering how a man who looked like a bear could move with such quiet precision. At first, she tiptoed around the lodge as if afraid to disturb him, but Caleb would catch her hesitations and gently nudge her forward. "This is your home, too," he said once, catching her retreating from the kitchen. "Use it." The simple words struck harder than any insult she had ever borne. Your home. No one had spoken those words to her before. She began cooking meals in the great iron stove, testing recipes her mother had once taught her. Caleb was not a man of many words, but when he took a bite and said, "Good," with a short nod, she felt her chest glow with pride. On the nights he went further, "Best stew I've had since the war," or "Your bread could shame a baker," Maggie found herself smiling long after the dishes were washed. The house itself was a wonder. She dusted the carved banisters, straightened the books in the small library, and swept the wide planked floors until they gleamed. In the evenings, when the wind howled and rattled the shutters, she and Caleb sat by the fire, the crackling flames filling the silence between them. Sometimes he whittled, shaping blocks of pine into birds and bears. Sometimes she sewed by lamplight, her hands busy, but her heart strangely at ease. It was in the little things that Caleb showed her more care than anyone else ever had. He always waited until she sat before serving himself. He repaired her boots with his own hands when he saw the soles were thin. Once, when she slipped on the icy path outside and twisted her ankle, he scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing, carrying her inside with a gentleness that stole her breath. "Rest," he ordered, placing her on the bed. "The chores can wait." "You'll have to do them then," she teased weakly. "Then I will," he replied simply, and he meant it. Slowly, Maggie began to change. The hollow look in her eyes softened. Her laughter returned, hesitant at first, then stronger, like a spring bubbling after a long frost. She discovered she had a gift for organizing the pantry, for making the cabin not just clean, but welcoming. Caleb noticed. "Feels more like a home now," he said one evening, his gaze lingering on her with quiet warmth. The mountain itself became part of her healing. Caleb showed her how to snowshoe across the drifts, how to track rabbits, how to split kindling without splintering it. She marveled at the strength in her own arms after weeks of practice. Once, when she managed to lift a log half her size and set it neatly on the stack, Caleb gave her a rare grin. "You're stronger than you know." Those words sank deeper than he realized. All her life she had been told she was weak, clumsy, useless. To hear the opposite from a man like him, the man who could build palaces from timber and hold back a storm with his shoulders, meant everything. Yet there were moments of silence, too, where shadows lingered between them. At night, when Caleb stared into the fire too long, Maggie wondered what ghosts haunted him. And when she caught her reflection in the tall glass windows, she wondered how a woman like her could ever truly belong beside him. Still, their bond grew. One evening, after she had baked pies with the last of the autumn apples, Caleb leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching her. "You make this place more than walls," he said quietly. "You make it alive." Her hands stilled on the dough. "You don't mind that I take up space?" she asked, her voice trembling. Caleb's eyes met hers, unwavering. "You're not a burden, Maggie. You're the reason I built all this." The words undid her. For the first time in years, tears spilled not from shame, but from something like joy. She turned away, flustered, but his hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder, steady, reassuring. In the heart of winter, the mountain cabin was warm with more than fire. It was warm with something fragile, something growing between them, stronger each day. And though neither spoke the word, both knew it. Love was taking root. Winter on Pine Mountain was long and unforgiving. But inside the lodge, Maggie and Caleb had carved out something almost sacred. Yet peace is fragile when the world beyond refuses to forget. It began with a letter smuggled up the mountain by a passing trader. Caleb took it silently, his brow furrowing as he read the crooked script. Maggie saw the change in his face, the tightening jaw, the way his scarred hand clenched around the paper. When she asked, he folded the letter and placed it in the fire without a word. But she caught the name signed at the bottom, William Hayes, her father. That night, Caleb confessed what the letter said. William and Victoria were claiming that the sale of Maggie was unlawful. They had gone to the county judge, arguing Caleb had bought her like cattle, and that she must be returned home immediately. More than that, Victoria had spread rumors in town that Caleb was keeping Maggie prisoner on the mountain, using her as unpaid labor. Maggie's heart sank. After all this time, after the warmth, the healing, they still wanted to drag her back into chains. "They'll never stop," she whispered. Caleb looked at her across the fire, his voice steady but hard. "Then we'll face them. You are not their property. You are my wife. And more than that, you are your own woman." But Maggie's doubts crept in. When she lay awake at night, she remembered the jeering voices in the square, the cruel laughter. What if the law sided with her family? What if she truly was nothing more than a burden he had purchased out of pity? Her fears only deepened when she discovered a locked chest in Caleb's study. One afternoon, while he worked outside, curiosity and insecurity drove her to try the key that hung by the window. Inside, she found documents, blueprints, contracts, and a deed. The deed bore Caleb's name, granting ownership of acres of land rumored to hold rich veins of stone and perhaps even silver. Suddenly, she understood why men like William Hayes or any greedy outsider might target him. But there was more. At the bottom lay a faded photograph, a woman and two children smiling in front of a city townhouse. Maggie's breath caught. She realized at once they were Caleb's family, the one he had lost in the fire. For the first time, she felt like an intruder in a life not meant for her. How could she, clumsy and unwanted, ever compare to the graceful woman in the photo? When Caleb returned, she confronted him, trembling. "Why didn't you tell me about the land, about them?" He stood in the doorway, snow melting from his shoulders, and for a long moment said nothing. Then he stepped closer, voice rough. "Because I didn't want you to see me for what I am, a man haunted, a man who failed to save the ones who mattered most. I thought if I gave you too much truth, you'd leave too." "I wouldn't leave," Maggie whispered, though her chest ached. Still, the silence between them grew heavy. Matters worsened when word reached them through Marcus Iron Bear, the Lakota leader who often traded with Caleb. He brought troubling news. William Hayes had allied with a wealthy industrialist named Harrison Blackwell. Blackwell coveted Caleb's land for its resources, and together they were pressing charges to seize it. If Caleb resisted, they promised to use the law or force. Maggie felt the old despair rising, the sense that no matter how far she ran, her family's cruelty would always find her. But this time, something inside her resisted. She thought of Caleb's quiet faith in her, of the way he said she was not a burden. She thought of the home they had built together from laughter, firelight, and trust. When Caleb spoke of leaving, of abandoning the land to spare her, Maggie surprised even herself. She put her hand over his and shook her head. "No, we don't run, not anymore. If they want to take me, let them come. But they'll find I'm not the girl they left in the square. I'll stand with you." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then Caleb's hand closed around hers, firm and certain. "Then we'll face them together." But even as they found strength in each other, the storm outside gathered force. The Hayes family and Blackwell were coming, armed with money, influence, and lies. And the sanctuary of Pine Mountain was about to become a battlefield. The snow was falling thick on Pine Mountain when the intruders came. Maggie and Caleb heard them before they saw them, the crunch of many boots, the snorts of horses, the sharp bark of orders echoing through the trees. By the time the first figures appeared from the white mist, Caleb already stood at the door of the lodge, rifle in hand. William Hayes, pale and shivering, shuffled forward under the shadow of Harrison Blackwell. Behind them marched half a dozen armed men, and the sheriff himself, hat pulled low, pistol at his side. "Caleb Thornfield," Blackwell's voice rang sharp, "you're harboring stolen property. This woman was unlawfully taken, and by authority of the court, she's to be returned to her family. Step aside." Caleb's stance didn't waver. His massive frame filled the doorway, rifle steady, eyes burning cold. "She is not property. She is my wife, and you'll not take her." The sheriff stepped up, reading from a paper. "Court order. You resist. It's the gallows." Behind Caleb, Maggie's heart thundered. Every instinct screamed to hide, to shrink away as she had all her life. But she remembered his words. "You are not their burden." She stepped forward, standing at his side. "If you think you can drag me back," she called out, her voice shaking but strong, "then you'll have to hear me say it plain. I will not go. I belong here. I choose him, not you, not ever again." A murmur rippled through the men. Even the sheriff hesitated. Blackwell's face darkened. "Enough of this. Seize her!" The hired guns moved, but so did the forest. From the tree line, Marcus Iron Bear and his warriors emerged, bows drawn, rifles raised, forming a silent wall. Their presence shifted the air. Suddenly, it was no longer a handful against one man, but two forces standing toe to toe. Caleb raised his voice, low but carrying. "You come for her, you come through me, through us, and I promise you, the mountain will remember the blood you spill here." Blackwell sneered, but the sheriff's hand faltered on his gun. He looked at Maggie, saw the defiance blazing in her eyes, and then at the warriors surrounding them. Slowly, he lowered the paper. "This ain't worth dying for, Harrison." "Coward!" Blackwell spat. He reached for his pistol, but before steel cleared leather, Caleb's rifle roared. The bullet split the ice-cold air and shattered the pistol from Blackwell's hand, leaving his palm bleeding and his power broken. Panic broke the men's ranks. The hired guns fled into the storm, William Hayes stumbling after them, his cries lost to the wind. Blackwell, clutching his ruined hand, was dragged down the mountain under the sheriff's reluctant guard. Silence fell again, broken only by the hush of snow and Maggie's trembling breath. She turned to Caleb, tears in her eyes, not of fear, but of fierce relief. "You stood for me?" she whispered. He lowered the rifle, his hand finding hers. "We stood together?" And as the storm raged around the lodge, Maggie knew that for the first time in her life, she had faced the world and not bowed her head. Night fell quiet after the storm of men and guns had passed. The fire in the lodge burned steady, painting the walls with a golden glow. Caleb sat in his great chair by the hearth, his rifle leaning forgotten in the corner. Maggie nestled beside him on the rug, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders. For the first time, there was no fear pressing on her chest, only the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of the flames, and the knowledge that they had stood their ground. She looked up at him, her voice soft. "All my life they called me useless, a burden. Tonight, for the first time, I didn't feel small." Caleb's hand, rough from years of work, brushed a tear from her cheek. "You've never been small, Maggie. You were only waiting for someone to see you as you are, and I see you." She swallowed the lump in her throat, leaning against him, feeling the strength of his arm around her. The cabin that once felt like his fortress now felt like their home. "Will the world ever leave us be?" she asked quietly. He pressed a kiss to her hair, his words a promise as much as hope. "Let them come. Whatever storm waits beyond these mountains, we'll weather it, together." Maggie closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of peace. For once, the laughter in the town square, the cruelty of her family, the sharp sting of shame, all of it seemed far away, muffled by the crackle of fire and the beating of his heart. And though the question lingered, would love be enough against the world outside, she chose to believe it would. Stories like Maggie and Caleb's remind us that love is not about perfection, It's about seeing worth where the world only saw weakness. A woman once called a burden found her place as a queen, and a man scarred by loss found his redemption in her strength. I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Do you believe love can truly stand against the cruelty of the world? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read each one. And if you still believe in second chances, stay close. The next story is waiting for you.